So let's start this. And first question: we've talked about war a while ago, but it's been a while, and we all have bad memories. So well, basically, we don't really remember what we talked about back then. So we're just gonna discuss war again because it's a really interesting subject. But this time, I want to focus, if we can, a little bit more on the morality side of it, the morality of war and all that. And but just to start, what is war and what causes war? Maybe those are good questions just to get the ball rolling, and then we can get to the morality part of it. I don't know
So I mean, traditionally we think of war as physical combat, like one country, usually a country, um, but I guess it doesn't have to be necessarily, gets a group of people, or nowadays it could be like drones, but traditionally it's you get a group of people together that are armed and that are trying to either infringe on another country's territory physically, or physically assault any of the people in it. Yeah, it is kind of tricky to define it. But the thing is, today, a lot of, hey, Natasha, today, a lot of people argue that there's other kinds of war, like information warfare, and stuff like that. So I guess that's all safe for now.
And Natasha, you got here just in time. So we're going to be talking about war tonight, and we're going to start by talking about what is war, what causes war, and then try to get to the morality bits. Your microphone might be off. So do you guys agree with actually, Natasha, do you want to, in your opinion, what is war? Since you just arrived.
Oh my gosh, I usually need like a little bit of time to.
No, okay, you can take your time. Does anyone else want to try to define war? Are we in agreement with Michael?
Well, Michael brought up some very good things, that it's not always violence, but I guess it's trying to take something from other peoples, whether it be another nation or whatever, by force or by deception or whatever. I mean, that's if we're thinking about war in the context that which we are experiencing it, where we have attacks from, we believe, from nation states, at least it looks like it, where they hack into important infrastructure systems in our country. That's not good.
Yeah.
And sometimes war can actually be vague. Sometimes it can be unclear whether you're committing war or helping a country. Like, for example, the war in Iraq, or sometimes if there's like a dictatorship and you come in and you try to save the country, it can be unclear whether that's an act of war or whether that's you trying to help them.
I think we have to make a distinction between war, real war, versus people using war as a metaphor, or maybe acts of aggression, but they're not violent or physically violent or destructive. And to describe, like a cyber war or a psychological warfare or things like that, I think war is a destructive, for me, when you say war, it's a destructive, physically destructive attack or assault by one entity, be it a country, a nation state these days, used to be kingdoms or tribes, against another. Yeah.
I understand and agree with what you're saying, but I guess what gives me pause is, and we don't know if it was some nefarious group or a nation state, but the ransomware attack on one of the major food suppliers in our country, probably nobody starved to death, but the potential to seriously impact our distribution of food and fuel and stuff is an act of violence.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would not
It's
say it is.
it's just the means that are
Right.
non-violent. Yeah.
Exactly. I just wouldn't think that would be war, as in launching missiles or sending an invasion force across the borders.
Yeah, often countries go for non-violent economic means before committing war. So sanctions are a really popular like way of trying to take action before actually going to war.
Yeah.
Is it possible we have gotten into an area where certain types of actions are as destructive as war, but our language is just not prepared for that? We don't have a word for it? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, maybe not. Like, for example, there's terrorism. There are acts of terrorism and acts of war, and I think there's still a distinction being made between, a fine distinction between what is an act of terrorism and what is an act of war. And an act of terrorism certainly can be a base, a cause for what's the term, casus belli, or however you pronounce that. But there still might be some distinctions there in terms of the responses that governments will take between one or the other. Yeah. So
Does war have to be between states?
I don't think
No.
so. That kind of makes it
No.
easier, but I don't think
No.
in general, like the ancient Greeks,
yeah.
sometimes rich families would fight wars against each other, or even like the War of the Roses, right? That was within England. So yeah, I don't think it has to be between states.
No, it doesn't. Just has to be between, I suppose, two armed forces, whether they're armed formally or with yeah.
Well, the War of the Roses is an example of what we actually call civil war, just like the American Civil War or the Spanish Civil War. But we do consider that usually a war.
Yes.
So it does seem that a war is not always between two states. It can be
No.
within the state.
Mhm.
My understanding is that conflict long precedes the nation state.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think that we should limit the definition to war to physical attack, because if you were to think about anyone, I mean, now especially, if say one country is able to successfully collapse the economic structure of another country through intentional means, and that country goes under, and then they're be able to be taken advantage of or annexed or exploited or something like that, I don't think it would be accurate to say that the country didn't wage war on the other one. I think a war is more about an intention to limit or undermine or weaken, or it's an intention to have power over another entity. And I think it's got to be a much more broader term that includes intention.
Yeah, I think nowadays war is probably a lot more strategic, where often if you play your cards right, you don't even need to go to war physically. If you just impose the right sanctions or the right propaganda or whatever, then it's almost like you won't even need to end up going to war. But
Can cause real physical damage through non-physical means. And that's kind of my point, why I don't think that physical means should be the definition of war.
Well, there's the famous von Clausewitz quote that war is diplomacy by other means.
The other means. Yeah.
It sounds like we're almost saying diplomacy is war by other means.
I don't think diplomacy is like intentionally trying to undermine other countries. Normally, diplomacy is you're trying to work with other entities. You're trying to create a mutual survival, not actually trying to weaken the other party.
I think what we're talking about, Shashir, and I understand what you're saying, but I think what we're talking about is when a group or possibly sponsored by a nation state, but maybe just an individual group attacks, does a cyber attack on the infrastructure that you have in a country. That is a non-violent act, but it nevertheless can still be an act of war because it affects people within the country, you know.
What it would be the difference between launching a cyber attack or launching a precision airstrike that might not kill anybody, but knocks out a country's electrical.
Well, I guess what we're struggling with is to try to define what that difference would be. So,
Well, I think it's fair to say that war seems to be a pretty ambiguous word. And I think it might mean different things because not everybody would usually use the word war to describe economic sanctions, even though that's in a way an act of aggression. But it's not a material attack on a different country. So I think that's why that would preclude that under certain definitions. Actually, the most common definition, I think, usually involves some sort of material destruction or material attack.
Yeah, for the purpose of this discussion, I think it might be helpful just to focus ourselves on the real physical violence and material destruction. Yeah.
Because even something like the Cold War, right? That wasn't exactly physical war.
Right. Because all these like Cold War and cyber attacks or sabotage and things like that, I think are in fact ways of that political actors try to impose their will or maybe coerce or whatever, weaken the opposing party opponent without actually going to war. You know, so yeah, it's and I like the term that I was looking for, that other term and Bruno, you mentioned, you raised it, acts of aggression. There are acts of aggression that are not, you know, at least in the traditional sense we think of as war. And in fact, those are the things that make states think, okay, does this mean war or not, real war or not? And there's still I think a line that states will have to cross when they actually decide that yes, this is something that justifies an act of, you know, war to be you know, waged against that party. I mean, going back, for example, to the second Iraq War, there really was a discussion between, well, there's an act of aggression. Does that justify now waging war? You know, so this is just my thought on it.
And that actually it makes me think, because we see the same thing in people, right? You might do something that is essentially an act of aggression against another person, like, for example, a verbal aggression, but we still consider that different from someone actually punching someone, because there you have the material act, you know, the physical act of aggression. So it's not to say that one thing is not an aggression or is not war in some broad sense, but we do tend to understand that distinction. And you were going to say something, Vladimir. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Yeah, I want to say that we may apply this term also to like inner war when you fight yourself, your, some
Mhm.
habits or desires or whatever part of you may dislike. And like for me, I definitely would project my personal like inner battles to the outer world, and how I understand words basically through my personal experience of fighting myself. And there are certain aspects of my personality which I constantly attack all the time, like desire to play video games, or desire to watch some stuff which I don't like to watch, or which make me weak and which make me addictive, or some other parts. And it seems that you may use the definition, like this definition of war, to apply it to yourself, and you may see better, like you may understand yourself better, comparing certain aspects of your personality and fight within them. And then when you understand this, you may see how real war between states or between people, between groups of people, actually going on. There are certain desires, like certain intentionality, and they have a conflict. They can't survive together. They can't be reconciled. And then there's one of them should be destroyed, or one of them should be suppressed, and essentially we have a war.
So it seems that the commonality is like the conflict, the conflict part of it is what is present in everything that we just described, is that there is an actual conflict.
And as Clausewitz, for example, the same definition is a duel between, like a war is a duel between two persons. But I would like to say it's like even within yourself, you may have a duel or a war. Like some instincts may basically compete for survival within a person.
Yeah, I
That
think
makes
in
sense.
some literary sense, yeah, you could consider war to be within a person, like a conflict of their desires. But yeah, I guess for the purpose of this discussion, we have to focus it on something to, I guess, if we want to have, I guess, a good discussion. So I guess for the purposes of this, do you all want to just focus on the real physical destruction war?
I like that idea. I like your idea to limit the discussion to what we traditionally recognize as war: rockets, guns, knives, bazookas, tanks, and ships, and all of that.
Right.
And
Atomic bombs.
not cyber attacks or internal struggles, full knowing that those things are a type of conflict as well. But I'm afraid if we make the concept that we're discussing too broad, we'll never get anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Well, if I can tie it back to what Vladimir is saying, is that there is a tie between the internal and the external. In terms of, if you look at a lot of warrior philosophy, it is very much personal philosophy. Like take, for example, Spartan's ideas of essentially perfection of the self. Generally, that had to do with that you perfect yourself in order to be a contributing member of society, to be a Spartan. And so that required both, because a Spartan was a warrior society. So essentially the internal struggle of being a good Spartan was the same as the external struggle of the society of Sparta.
Interesting. So there's a connection there.
Yeah.
Yeah, one may inform the other, but okay, yeah, one may inform the other.
Right. But yeah, I'd say, yeah, let's limit it to what we think of as the traditional war, which is physically destructive, very expensive, usually.
Yeah, I guess we have to ask this question, like when it's allowed to kill other people,
Right.
like whether it's moral or immoral, since the topic is the morality of war. Like when killing is allowed, in which circumstances?
Right. It's supposedly, they said it's very easy if it's for self-defense, then it's justifiable, but there are ways to I don't know, present situations and say, oh yeah, this is self-defense. And we've seen that happen so many times, you know, especially when it's preemptive war. Now we're getting into, you know, very iffy territory about just exactly how justifiable that is. You know.
And then there's also, is it okay to go to war with a country that's doing that's done nothing to your own country, but that you think has a, I don't know, human rights violations, or they have a dictatorship or something like that? Is it okay to go to war with them to try to change them? That's also an interesting question.
Well, you know, I'm thinking of Cambodia and Rwanda. You know, inaction of the rest of the world resulted in millions of deaths.
Right.
They weren't caused by the inaction, but by not stopping the people who were doing it. That might be justified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would tend to think there is, you can argue for the case.
Yeah, we can sorry, Ro, go ahead.
No, it's also been accepted, I think, to head off what you call this, crimes against humanity is, I think, is an accepted international law as a moral and legal basis.
Well, I guess I guess the central question of the central moral question of war is that if war is moral or not at all, you know, if
Right.
it's ever moral. And so I think it could be a good idea to start with David's question, because it's just such a, I guess that's what people think about when they think about the morality of war in general. Is it ever moral? You know, is it ever justifiable? Which is essentially a synonym in this case. And you're saying that in the Rwandan genocide, which incidentally they decided not to go to war in that case, and that produced terrible results. You're saying that would be one reason why it would be justified to go to war. It would be moral.
Let me put it this way. If my neighbor was holding a knife to his wife's throat, I might intervene. And I think that tendency on my part translates to the actions of a nation state.
Right. Yeah.
How many people have to die before it becomes a national ethical human rights violation?
That's really hard to put a number on that.
Yeah, but it's kind of important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me get the calculator.
If you're gonna go to war for it, like the number is actually kind of relevant.
Yeah, it is. I mean, but you know, I'm sure it's less than 1 million, but more than 1,000. Right?
It's gotta be more than 1,000?
Or at least, you know,
So-
I'm not saying that, I'm saying it's somewhere there in the middle.
So as long as
More
you do like
more or less than
1,000
two.
once, like every 5 years, and it's no
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah, I know, I'm not coming up with a number, but you know, I'm sure.
1,000, we should probably go to war with a couple countries.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And you know, and it wouldn't be called a war. It would be called, you know, if you're putting in troops basically to keep two sides apart, and then if one side attacks that buffer zone or those troops, then yeah, this means war.
I'm
Right,
not
that's-
sure that we could put a number on it,
No,
but we do know that there is that sometimes there's too much.
right,
And you know what went on in Rwanda was too much.
yeah.
So there's like a right amount.
No, there's,
No, I'm
No,
saying that we
there's-
can't
I wish
know
there
what the
were-
right
Talking about, and then
No, I
there's
know.
too much.
it would be nice if there was a number, but it's just, when does it, yeah.
And then I think you have to take into account the reason for the deaths too. Like, let's say you have a country that has a death penalty that they apply it in a little bit too many cases or a little too harshly, versus a country where they just execute people for speaking out bad against the government, or I don't know, a genocide or stuff like that. I think if it's those reasons, then it's more serious. But yeah.
I'm pretty sure the nations who do the genocide think their reasons are pretty.
Yeah, they think
They've
reasons
decided
are-
the reasons are within a certain allowable parameters.
Okay, help me out just a little bit. What? So the nations think they're justified. You're not saying they're justified. You're
Yeah,
saying that the
Yeah.
nations think
I
they're
think
justified.
they're justified.
Well, I think that, there's some parameters we can build around that. And I think that was largely the attempt of the United Nations, Do they succeed all the time? No. Are they very effective? Not all the time, no. Am I glad they exist? Yes.
Oh, but the problem with the United Nations in that case was particularly illustrative of that problem, is that it often doesn't work for a number of reasons, but it doesn't work. It was supposed to
I think
work.
that's what I just said.
No, I know, but the problem is that, well, I guess in that case, why did they not go to I guess we could start there. Why did they not intervene in that case? In that case, it's an example of a case in which they decided that it wasn't enough justification, even though people were being slaughtered in the streets.
And where is this?
We're still in the Rwandan genocide.
Oh, yeah. Well, because really the United Nations is, when it comes down to it, it's really the Security Council that we're talking about, right? I mean, because the Security Council can veto a lot of things, and it's basically, I think Clinton who did not feel the need to intervene until afterwards, and he admitted that he thought that was his biggest mistake in his administration,
Right.
not to respond to what was going on in Rwanda soon enough. I think
it wasn't even that they didn't respond, to be fair. It's that there were actual troops in Rwanda at that time that were doing peacekeeping missions, and the UN instructed them to leave. So it was more than not sending troops in. It was basically the fact that they took troops out.
Right.
Well, they didn't have a lot, but you got to look at the context of Rwanda and Bosnia. Has to do with what we're talking about. Interventions has to do with Somalia, because U.S. had sent troops into Somalia to quell their civil war, and then there was a Black Hawk Down incident that happened, and the U.S. withdrew their troops, and that kind of really soured the Clinton administration, the U.S. about intervening.
That's right. Forgot about that. But yeah, but they should have made the distinction between a civil war and genocide, but that's on hindsight. What can you do? I mean, I think the French also did something to help, mess up the situation there. I don't remember that clearly, but in terms of to head off to prevent violations of human rights, genocide, certainly I would, on principle, that is something that is justifiable. Now we go to Afghanistan now, and if you think about it, and it's probably a lot of women will be the most severely affected by if the Taliban takes over. You know, it's really hard to.
How do we determine when it's justifiable to go and intervene in a particular country, in a particular place? How is it possible to make that determination at all? I like the way you.
I think so in some cases.
I like the way you connected it to the example of your neighbor pointing a gun or a knife to his wife's neck, or that is an interesting way to put it. I think that illustrates the fact that we mostly think that it's justifiable to intervene in a situation in which someone is harming someone else.
Right.
And we sort of like translate that to international war as well, in a sense. Why is that? Is that a reasonable conclusion?
Well, if you look at self-defense law, there is, yes, you can use lethal force, or you can use force in proportion to a threat against you, what's a reasonable threat. And then there's several states have third-party self-defense, but when you can act to defend somebody else. And generally that is based upon saying if they have a reasonable threat against them, then you can act. Now, what makes it interesting, and there's been a big debate the last year, is what is the duty to intervene? Because just because you see somebody holding a gun to your neighbor's head doesn't mean you are obligated to intervene, because one, you could get shot yourself. I mean, do you have a duty to put yourself in danger? And generally that's come down to saying, well, it's not clear. Well, some states say, no, you have absolutely no duty to intervene. You see somebody getting mugged, you're under no obligation to step in.
But you have the.
But yeah, but some states actually now are saying, no, there is a duty to intervene, that if you can intervene in a way that still, without putting yourself at risk, you should. And there's, quote, Good Samaritan laws and things like that.
Yeah.
I think a further question is, let's take the case of Rwanda. Would it have been morally justifiable to risk the lives and limbs of your citizens to prevent another nation state from committing atrocities?
Yeah.
That's a tough call.
I think the article that you sent us on Facebook said one of the criterion is it has to have a reasonable chance of being successful, the war.
Right.
So, like, you should be at least a pretty confident that you're actually going to win it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
I didn't send those, but because I ascribed to them. I sent them because that could help, I think.
I think there's always supposed to be a responsibility that comes with power and equipment. So if you are equipped with skills and weaponry to fight on behalf of those who are not empowered, and I do think that there is a necessity to intervening. Like, I think that's just that's part of being part of a responsible society, where people who have intervene on those who cannot.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a basic moral human imperative. It's outside of law, outside of politics, that we do expect, just on a human level, that if something really bad is being done to a certain group, and you can stop it with maybe not too much damage to yourself, that you might be, there's the expectation that it's only right that you step in. Of course, there's that thing that it should also have a reasonable chance of success, because that's why nobody can intervene with what's going on with what do you call these in China, and the what's the group there?
The Uyghurs.
The Uyghurs. Yeah. You know,
Well, it's more than that. Is how do you define success, though? I mean, it's
right. To be able to stop it without damage to, injury or destruction to yourself as well.
right. But this is a problem. If you look at quote several interventions, in fact, Rwanda is a good example, because after the end of the Rwanda genocide, when the Tutsis took over, there was, and essentially aided by other African countries.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't the UN, it wasn't the US, but it was the African. That said, there's plenty of reports that the Tutsis ended up massacring Hutus afterwards.
Right.
And one of the reasons that guy from Hotel Rwanda is no longer kind of considered as famous, because apparently he was tied in with some of the counter massacres.
Right. And most people don't know about this, but a few years before that genocide was also about 300,000 died the other way.
Right.
Which was conducted by the victims of the bigger Rwandan genocide, inflicted on the Hutus. I think it was about, I don't know, in the 70s or something. And
right. Yeah. There'd been a history between, but
yeah,
if you look at like Iraq, where the Sunnis were minority group who held power during the Saddam years.
Yeah.
Were, I mean, literally following the end of the first Gulf War, were literally massacring Shiites.
Right.
After the U.S. invaded, the Shiites, which were the majority group, took power, and then there was plenty of oppression of the Sunnis. One thing that fueled ISIS and other groups was because Sunnis felt these were the groups that were fighting for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And,
So, yeah, a lot of these kind of conflicts, you can pinpoint in time saying one group massacred another, but
right.
that doesn't necessarily mean that the victim the next day could be the tormentor. I mean, they flip, a lot of things can flip, and depending on which side you choose.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you know you're picking the right side? Or is any side the right side?
If I understand the nature of the question that we're discussing, is when is it morally justified, or is it morally justified to intervene if you see that kind of thing going on?
Yeah, that's I guess that's the secondary question. The primary question was what are the reasons why one can justify war? What are the possible justifications for war? And we settled on self-defense and intervening in defense of a third party, essentially, which are the two reasons that are usually considered to be okay for self-defense, also of individuals. So we seem to be making that connection pretty strongly.
And then, but it gets kind of, self-defense gets a little tricky because like one country can do a lot of mini attacks over and over on another country. And then the question is, does that give, like let's say a country fires one rocket at you per month, right? Does that give you the right to go on a full-out war against them?
Well, let me put it this way: if I pointed a gun at you and shot at you, but just barely missed your head several times, wouldn't you consider that an aggressive act?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess in the rocket example I just said, I would think that would be like justification for an all-out war, but you're staking like thousands, if not millions, of lives now, as opposed to that smaller encounter. So
yeah. we still have to make the distinction between whether something is justified and whether it's smart to do so.
Well,
right?
and
Yeah.
also, if you do act, the circumstance under where you might feel like it was not justified to act doesn't exist.
Mhm.
So, I mean, you can't, last I checked, I'm not able to prove a negative.
You're not able to what a nation?
Prove a
Prove.
negative. In
Hmm.
other words, if this thing, or regardless of the war subject that we're talking about, if I say that I'm justified in this action because I did it, this thing never happened. Well, how did I know that thing never happened?
Yeah.
You know, how did I know it would have happened?
Yeah. So how preemptive are you allowed to be? Like, you can only be so preemptive at some point. Yeah, you have to actually
Yeah,
see. something happen.
well, I think preemption should not just be a fiction of my imagination.
Yeah.
Put it, but at the same time, if somebody's lining up missiles and tanks on my border,
That's
Right.
not in your imagination.
that's not in my imagination. You
Yeah.
know, so.
Well, you also kind of raised the issue of, in response to your question, Michael. I think we also use this criterion for people in civil society. The idea that yes, you can resort to self-defense, but it has to be somewhat proportional to the attack. And in that case, where you're saying, you know, if it's just a little scramble, right, a little skirmish, not all out invasion or all out provocation, even if it's just a little skirmish, yes, you're allowed to fight back, I guess, but it has to be, at least it would be reasonable if it were proportional and not, you know, if someone shoots a missile at you, it's not necessarily, well, even though it's debatable, but it's usually accepted that you can shoot a missile back, right? Not shoot 100 nukes.
Well, no, I would disagree. I think the response can be greater. Like, you see, and here's exactly how wars get started.
Perhaps greater, but do you think a lot
But you
greater?
don't
Can it be-
destroy
can it-
a
can it
whole
be
city.
a lot greater?
Yeah.
The example that comes to my mind is Andrew Wiggin. I don't know if you guys know who that is. He's a character in a fiction book, Ender's Game.
Mhm. It's
A
great
guy tried to beat him up, and he beat the crap out of him. I mean, totally beat him to a pulp. And the response was not proportional. And
Yeah.
one of his teachers said, "Why did you do that?" He says, "I knew I wasn't just winning that fight. I won all future fights."
Mhm.
So
Yeah. No. What we think of as really disproportionate would be somebody beats you up and you beat him up and his brother and his children, and and so that would be what I would think is blatantly disproportionate.
But the thing is, you're not just getting back at them for that one time.
Right.
Like David said, if they've really shown signs of aggression and that they're going to keep doing it over and over, you need to retaliate strong enough to prevent it from happening over and over again, not just to get justice for that one time.
I think
Right.
that might be folly. I think,
Right.
yeah. So I'm listening to all this and I'm thinking about, I can't help but think that it could be actually really useful to reduce this down to like the very personal level, because, you know, when you think of like nation states and you think of different entities and stuff like that, conflict and the feeling of persecution and the feeling of power is never short term, and it never stays anyway. And so I think, so I'm thinking about, I've got two kids, and I think about how often they fight and get into conflict, right? All the time. And I personally, I believe in intervening a lot. Like, so they go at it and I intervene. But the reason why this is really important is because I know both of my kids have self-interest. They want certain things at certain times. They lack skills to navigate it. They are both going to have tendencies to instigate or annoy or be stubborn. And when it comes to tension between different entities, I don't think trying to crush the one who's the offender when you catch them is ever going to be like the right choice. It's, you know, it should never be about trying to make sure they know who's boss. It's, I think intervention is good, but I think intervention in order to stop conflict and then also just mediating better relational skills, like making sure that there's no violence without trial, you know, trying to establish some ground rules for both entities to survive. Because I think if you're going to just suppress, like we're learning in Afghanistan, you're gonna have to just be in it forever, because suppression is a constant thing. You can never crush a country's spirit permanently. Like, that's not gonna happen. You have to either be just a constant bully trying to undermine any kind of self-sufficiency, any kind of pride, just indefinitely, or you're going to have to be more committed to like an education or laying some ground rules saying, you know, if this happens, we'll intervene and do this. If you do this, then this. But mostly not controlling, not destroying, not trying to stop a bully from being a bully, just you know, trying to increase the success rate of relationships between states that get into conflict.
So yeah, that's interesting. So like, let's say you have a country that like, I guess, I mean, it's a really interesting debate. Like you're saying, it's not good to just try and crush their spirit so that they stop bothering you. Let's say they fire one rocket at you. Then the next month they fire 2 rockets at you. Then they fire 3 rockets at you. Then they like.
Then you already have a pattern of escalation there, and so that's different now.
Like,
Yeah.
don't ignore the first rocket. Be like,
Right.
we don't like rockets.
Right.
Let's talk about why you're firing rockets. Like, is there something that you
Right.
want? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how successful that'll be.
like, if they want something to not fire rockets, then let's like talk about what they want and just have a conversation.
Right.
If they just want
What
to
if-
fire rockets, then
I think Japan should call Korea right now and say, don't fire any more rockets.
right.
Yeah. What if they want
But
you to convert to
even
religion or political ideology or something like that?
What was the first part?
Religion or political ideology.
I didn't hear the whole thing. I didn't.
Like what if the reason they're firing rockets at you is because they want you to convert to their religion or their political ideology?
Or it could be, what if the reason they're firing rockets at you is because they feel that you are oppressing them? So there are so many,
Right. But I think
you know.
conversation is like so necessary. And also just
Right.
setting up natural.
I don't think when we were talking about that we realized that what we were saying could be perceived as you would out and out crush another country.
Mhm.
I don't think anybody is proposing that we do that.
What about the value of deterrence?
Well, more or less. It could
Right.
be. It could be proposed. Actually, let's talk about. Because I wanted to bring up the most famous example of a moral choice, moral problem related to war, which is the dropping the atomic bomb, and that is a very interesting problem to solve. So I do want to propose that we kind of talk a little bit about that and try to solve that problem. And partially, something that people a lot of the times they don't understand, and that now it's been brought up to people's attention, like historians and stuff, is that part of the reason why they dropped the atomic bomb was not just to end the war. It was also to make sure the Russians understood, what would happen if they continue to be expanding, and essentially to deter the Russians from future expansion. Because they were that, at that time, the Russians, well, the Soviets were moving towards Japan, they were moving towards Korea, and they wanted to make sure that it was known that the United States had this overwhelming force. And that obviously that applied to Japan as well. They wanted Japan to know, well, there's no winning this war, and it had to be very, very clear. So in that case, it was pretty much about crushing someone and crushing someone's spirit, not just even the Japanese, also the Russians. So, but that example raises a lot of moral problems. Is it right to kill a bunch of people to make an example out of them,
Right.
to deter other people from waging war against you? That's one question. Another question is it okay to kill a bunch of people in order to save some of your people?
Is that the reason they did that, though?
Well, it was
There
one
are
of
a
the
lot
reasons.
of reasons.
To make an example.
Well,
Yeah.
it was one of the reasons.
It was a
It
demonstration.
was an added bonus, but it was an
Well-
important bonus at that time, because at that time it was very unclear what was going to happen with the Russians. So it was actually a pretty important strategic, arguably, because they could have chosen a different route, and in fact, they could have chosen just to use one bomb instead of two. But two bombs made it more clear.
There were so many things. There was also a scientific experiment, because there were two different types of
Yes.
nuclear
Right.
devices that
True.
they wanted to find out, and they picked similar sized cities so they could compare the destructive effects, and why they could not have dropped the first bomb. If it's really for political demonstration, why they could not have dropped the first bomb just in Tokyo Bay, where they'd kill a lot of fish but not a lot of people.
Well,
There are just no pure motives.
you understand there wasn't
whatsoever.
precision bombing. I mean, there was actually debate whether to just set off the bomb, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific where the
Yeah.
Japanese could see it.
Right. That's
That
why I
was-
said Tokyo Bay,
Yeah.
in the middle of Tokyo Bay, so everyone could see it.
Well, that wouldn't have done the trick, though, because they had to demonstrate, the whole point of the bomb was to demonstrate the power of the bomb and how it could kill people.
I think if they see that explosion in the middle of Tokyo Bay, they could easily extrapolate how destructive that would be on a city. And they could have said, okay, there's no response then.
Well,
yeah.
reasonable people could, but they
Yeah.
weren't dealing with reasonable people.
But well, on the other hand, it's just come out, I think, when after the Soviet Union fell, that the Japanese were sending feelers for surrender through the Russians, and not the Russians, the Soviets. And they were not forwarding them to the Allies because the Soviet Union at least this is what historian says, wanted to get into the war against the Japanese, so that settle some scores from the past, and so.
Yeah,
Right.
no, that was another thing, that they were fearing a Russian invasion as well, and they wanted to stop it
Right.
as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Because that's
Yeah.
what the Russians did, not what the Russians did with Germany, because they were already going to get there. But in essence, they were figuring that we were probably going to have a scenario just like in Germany of like sheer domination, right? Both Allies and Russia controlling Japan, and that was undesirable to the United States. That's not what they wanted. So that was another reason they wanted to end the war quickly.
Yeah, but what I meant that in saying that they were not as unreasonable. The Japanese were not as hell bent on just win or die as being portrayed, because they were sending feelers through the Soviets, except that it wasn't to Stalin did not see to his advantage to.
Well,
to-
there was an internal debate within Japan. I mean, they themselves were split two minds. They kind of took the emperor to break the logjam
Right.
to ultimately agree to
problem-
surrender.
Like the inherent problem with large acts of aggression is precedent. If you use big weapons, then you're going to create a competition for using big weapons.
Right.
And the more you escalate it, the more that it will escalate. I mean, that you can take that again to the personal level, and that's just the way that human nature works. Is it's never going to be this final sweep. You can say
No.
that you're doing it preemptively to send a message, but fundamentally you can't know what will happen.
Right.
So I wouldn't say that anybody was being unreasonable before we dropped a bomb. I think that was unreasonable to decimate so many innocent lives in order to prevent something that you can't really know is going to happen. And all you teach is that the world needs to produce better equipment in order to protect themselves. Like that's all that you actually end up sending, is that it's important to have big equipment. Therefore, you create a precedent. And that's I think that kind of action is just short-sighted. I think it has no thought for actual world peace or what it takes to navigate complex conflict.
Well, except that you got to look at the history of World War II. Both the Allies and the Axis had killed already, by that point, had already killed like some 20 million people worldwide. I mean, the fire bombings of Tokyo.
Always come from somewhere. I'm saying in order to move forward, you have to be more resourceful, because all you do is set up the future to be dependent on big guns when you use big guns.
Right, but I think that argument was already out. I mean, the Japanese killed millions of Chinese. They killed millions of others around.
Already being the standard doesn't mean that it's just a foregone conclusion that you should continue doing it.
Well, I'm just saying the Japanese, without, I mean, whether the atomic bombs were dropped or not, the Japanese probably weren't going to surrender.
You don't know.
Without
It doesn't, and even if their immediate surrender is like not the case, there's no like promise that a surrender eventually, they say it was to prevent loss of lives, but that's just not responsible.
Well, but the Japanese were defeated. They knew they were defeated, especially by the time Okinawa fell. They could have. The Japanese had plenty of opportunity.
Pick the people who are going to die rather than us choosing for them.
The Japanese
let's try to figure
are
out if
choosing
it
to
was-
kill people already. I mean, this is the Japanese. This idea, and again, I'm sorry to say, has that they were victims. Yes, individual Japanese civilians were. The Japanese government had already committed long to the road of war. They
Again, choosing on behalf of who, like, that we can just take lives because we don't want them to bother us anymore. Like,
they were already.
Yeah, but it's
Again,
this
yes,
assumption that the Japanese will not surrender. As I said, that's something that I think a lot of people like to tell themselves.
right.
Because as I
supposed to
said,
be a
they were
commitment.
sending feelers. They were trying to
True,
find
but
a
they
way
could have-
out through
They
through
could
the-
have
through-
done more
through
than
the
send
s-
feelers. They
through the
certainly could have.
Soviet- well, but if the feelers were stopped cold because Stalin did not
Right, but they could have.
encourage it. So
They could have publicly just. They had other ways of surrendering. They wanted
well,
to surrender
it's-
with
it's-
honor to keep a certain sense. And
Sure.
this is not the first time in war stuff like
Right.
that has happened. I mean, it certainly
Yeah,
happened in the
yeah, that's what I
the Civil
said.
War
So
and the
there are
Revolution.
surrender feelers, and
Well, but I think Sashir makes a good point. You know, what in that case the United States wanted was an unconditional surrender, which is
Mhm.
different. It was different from a negotiated surrender.
Yeah,
The United States wanted to quickly and decisively win the war without any conditions, which
Sure.
was the strategy. So that was what they were trying to achieve. And I think we can weigh the moral the arguments in favor of this being a moral decision against being an immoral decision. And but yeah,
Quick
one of
results is
Right,
exactly
but this
the
is
problem with
right.
human beings being impatient and trying to just get what you want when you want it is exactly a short-sighted state of mind. Like that is what produces bad relationships later, when you don't go through the effort and the time and the labor to produce and cultivate.
Okay. We're not going to agree on whether or not dropping the atomic bomb was morally justified.
well, I don't want us to agree. I just want us to weigh the pros
right.
and
Yeah,
cons.
no, we're
Well,
just looking at the points of view.
I perceived, perhaps wrongly, I perceived that the question on the table that we are discussing is whether or not war it can ever be justified.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
this
I
is
just
kind
wanna
of a
get back-
second question.
I think again, the problem with discussing the dropping of the A-bomb or really any other has to be put in context of the whole war. I mean, the Germans certainly, by the time the Russians were at the German border, I mean, the Germans were defeated. When the Battle of the Bulge failed, they were defeated. They didn't surrender. They didn't surrender until well after Berlin was taken. Why didn't they? But the Germans were making the argument at the beginning of the war, when they'd already taken all of Western Europe, that the British should surrender. Why didn't the British just surrender at that point? If we're to talk about who's going to surrender where, there's plenty of time where both sides could have surrendered.
Well, and here we're talking about Japan as well, but you know, to your point, I mean, we have to look at the facts. You know, the facts were that they were encountering tremendous resistance from Japan, and there were no real signs that Japan was willing to agree to an unconditional surrendering. In fact, after the two bombs were launched, and you know, it was evident that it was a complete catastrophe, and that there was absolutely not only there was no way to win the war, there's no way to avoid complete Holocaust in Japan. Everybody was going to die essentially. You know, people were being told that they needed to commit suicide when the Allies invaded. Also, the Soviets were invading from the other side, and they were getting close to actually they started taking away territory from Japan in Manchuria.
Right.
So, and even under those desperate, dire circumstances of complete annihilation for the whole Japanese race and nation, there was still a tie. I think there were 8 or something like, I don't remember what the exact number were, but the High Council in Japan, it was tied. It was tied. So, half of them decided that they didn't want to surrender, that they wanted to fight until the bitter end, until basically everybody was dead. And the other half were just like, okay, I mean, they're launching these like mega bombs on us. You know, the Soviets are coming in with millions of people. There's absolutely no way we're going to survive this. And it's just pointless to let people die, everybody die. And the emperor had to be called in, and he was the tiebreaker. And he said, well, you know, we have to surrender because this is just going to end very, very badly. So, you know, if after launching 2 atomic weapons, after the Soviets invaded Manchuria with millions of soldiers, I mean, even if after all that they couldn't make up their minds, imagine, you know, if that hadn't happened. So I think there's a powerful argument that they needed a lot of convincing. I think those are just the facts. If that's right or not, I mean, that's a different story. But I think the facts are, I mean, they needed a lot of convincing.
So yeah, kind of to back up Bruno, and I think this is, I'll just say, I don't know if everyone always can be reasoned with. And I know that's like a very sad thing. Like, I don't know if there's maybe a hope that we can change humanity to a point that people can be reasoned with. But I think it might just be a fact of just the human race that
No.
there exist people that cannot be reasoned with. I don't know if we can get the world to a point
No.
where we can change that.
If people can be reasoned with, there is no need to think about the morality of war, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think there would be war at all in the first place, but
You know, what amazes me is how much, how many movies and television things that people solve their problems or their disagreements with violence.
mhm,
Maybe that's what makes a good story, but you know,
yeah,
uh,
because we're chimpanzees.
isn't it much,
Yeah.
isn't it much more noble to sit down and discuss your differences and find a solution than it
Mhm,
is to attack each other physically?
Sure.
So yeah, I think you should make every attempt possible to do that first, to reason with the person. But I do, or country or whatever. But I do think it can get to a point where you've lost, where you can no longer reason, where their actions are not rational.
And World War II actually taught us that lesson, right? I mean, that's another lesson from the war, is that they tried to reason with Hitler a lot. You know, they spent years trying to reason with Hitler, and there was just no reasoning with him. And that's what
yeah.
Churchill said from the beginning. I mean, this guy is crazy, and he wants to grab as much land as he can, and he wants to enslave people, and he wants to kill
Right.
people, and there's just no reasoning with him.
Right,
Yeah,
but
it's
they also
learned.
need to go back to the Treaty of Versailles, which I think laid out the whole thing. I mean,
Yeah, no, yes.
once they, as I said, which as Natasha said, you can't try to basically pound a people into dust. And that's what happened to Germany after World War One, and that's why this basic giant chip on the shoulder of all Germans that allowed the rise of Hitler, and they just basically said,
Well,
Retaliation and hopelessness is a thing that is learned.
Right.
It is taught by history. So you say this is what we learned in World War II, except we've been doing this like the whole time.
Is it all taught, or is some of it just people's personality? Like some people, like some leaders have just like a personality. I mean, forget like aside from history, aside from the past, aside from family drama, like they just have a personality that's just fight at all costs. Do you believe that, or I'm curious?
No, that's kind of all it takes
Yeah,
is something personal, and you can transpose that onto onto as much power as you can get.
right. And
right. There's, I mean, this idea about, I mean, the history of war has actually mostly been about you completely wipe out your enemies. I mean, you look at what Rome did to Carthage. I mean, that was,
Right.
but I mean, David brought up an interesting part because I was thinking about the beginning of the movie Gladiator. And there's a line where where Quintus goes to General Maximus and says, well, why don't these Germans just surrender, these Germanic tribes? You know, people should know when they're beaten. And Maximus says, well, would we?
right,
I mean, this is the point, is that, again, history to some extent is written by the winners, and obviously World War II is one, and we can pretty easily say the Nazis and Imperial Japan were pretty evil people. But that said, if things have been flipped around,
right,
Well, that's why I'm saying exactly is like this exchange can't stop until we actually start, until people with power and responsibility actually start doing it differently, rather than, you know, drawing the line in the sand and saying, do what we say or else,
because
actually doing it differently.
right,
But it takes the people with the power to make the difference, because people without are still very much not like they don't have anything to negotiate with. So
Right. You know, and
I think another thing that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that another question that it raises, and this is not something that was particular to that actual bombing. Also, in the beginning of the war, not in the beginning, sorry, throughout the whole war, the British and the Americans were completely destroying German cities in order to try to win the war, and Germany was doing the same thing. So there was, by the time the atomic bomb was launched, there had been this debate going on for some time, especially in the West, because the Germans weren't really concerned about that, but for the most part, but in the West at least, are we doing too much? Like, how far can we go in terms of like killing these civilians, killing these populations? And those are some of the issues that the total war raises, especially
Yeah.
industrial total war. Is it
As-
okay for you to kill whole cities of people in order to win the war, or is
Well-
that a line that you cannot cross? And that was a conversation that people were having as they were fighting the war, especially when the British got a little bit more aggressive, and Dresden happened, and
Right.
so. But that's a very difficult question to answer, and it's a question that is really, if we have another war like this, I mean, this is something that is going to come up again, unfortunately. And
yeah,
it's a
I mean,
difficult
even
question to answer.
in Serbia, in Yugoslavia, if you remember those news videos of supposedly precision bombs that were targeted and would hit right straight to the whatever the military structure, or it turns out later on that those were kind of cherry picked. A lot of them were not as accurate as those videos were showing, and so
Well, there's
always
no such thing as precision munitions.
no.
Even
no,
if you hit
yeah.
your target, you can still do, I mean, a bomb blowing up is still going to do a lot of damage.
Right, exactly. As I'm saying, and so that is a valid, when because the Royal Air Force had basically two sections of Fighter Command, which is Defense and Bomber Command, and the head of Bomber Command was really gung ho about this. Let's just bomb the cities, bomb them to until they surrendered, and it turns out it didn't work. Afterwards, they found out that German industrial production actually kept going up even as the bombing intensified, and
as I understand it, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, if you've heard or know of anything different, but as I understand it, referencing the example that you gave, Bruno, is, as I understand it, the Germans first started bombing civilians.
yes,
And
Spanish Civil War.
As a consequence, I wasn't thinking about Spanish Civil War, but that too. As a consequence of Germany's actions, bombing civilians, the Brits viewed this as an existential threat. In other words, they didn't. I understood it, and you guys may know differently. I understood it that the Brits initially didn't want to do that, but once civilians were killed in a bombing attack, and those bombs were aimed at civilians in order to terrorize them, then it becomes an existential threat. That's holding the knife to your throat.
Well,
except that I think during the Battle of Britain, the Germans were actually initially very careful not to bomb civilian targets. They were bombing airfields. Right.
I think you're correct. I have heard that the first incidents of bombing civilians was an accident.
Right. And then the British actually launched one of the first, early in the war, this is 1940, 1939, really did bomb, I think it was Berlin, during the
Right.
Battle of Britain, and that's when the Germans said, "Well, then all bets are off."
No,
Right.
Right, the British launched-
I think to be honest, to be fair, I think the Germans started. I think they did bomb London a little bit before that, and that was
well, they
when the
bombed
British.
Coventry pretty badly. I mean, both sides were killing
Coventry, I
civilians.
think, came
This-
later,
this is-
Yeah.
but I think London was the first one to be bombed, and I think that was actually the whole thing actually started by mistake, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
I
right.
think
The
the
first one
Germans
was-
didn't actually meant to
Yeah.
bomb London. I think it was
No.
actually a mistake at first. But
Right.
the British didn't know that. And
Well, again, yeah, they didn't have, there's no such thing as precision munitions. I mean, they were
yeah, I mean, mistakes happen.
trying to, whether, if you tried to bomb military targets, you would, if a military target was close to a civilian, chances are you'd hit the civilian target. That was not,
Yeah.
I mean, they were,
But the fact is, as soon as this whole thing started, and let's
No.
be honest, it was going to start anyways.
Yeah.
You know, it was just a matter of time.
Right.
The question was asked, you know, how far can we go, you know? And but this is also a question about the wars, industrial wars in general, you know, because it's very hard. It doesn't matter if it's bombarding cities
Right.
or if it's something else, but it's very hard to distinguish who's innocent, right?
Right,
Who's the enemy combatant and who are the civilians, and how
Yeah.
far can you go to win the war? Can you
Right.
kill all the civilians of the opponents?
It's
Right.
like a
There's just
Frito.
lot.
It's like a Frito-Lay chip, right? Once you start, you can't stop.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah. And that's
But it's a hell of a
the
moral
sad thing about
conundrum.
war.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring up something. I think one of the big issues with war. So I think general populations are usually reasonable. It's when you have single leaders that are unreasonable. That's the problem. So you could have one unreasonable leader leading millions of very, very reasonable people, right? And because of the one unreasonable leader, that's what makes you have to go to war. So I think a lot of the focus should be on trying to create a good government with lots of checks and balances so as to minimize the possibility of that situation. It's kind of my view.
Yeah, but it's also nations do not engage in all-out war unless the population is eager for it. You know,
there's a theory
that's-
that democracies want,
looking at
Wait,
history. I
wars.
mean, the Germans under the Nazis, they were gung ho about it. The Japanese citizenry during World War II, they were gung ho about this very militarized society, and
But often
Yeah.
often it's an unreasonable leader
is.
that creates the
That's-
sentiment that makes them think it's urgently needed.
yeah, that's true. I mean, if the unreasonable leader wanted to capitalize on it, in World War I, the unreasonable leader was Kaiser Wilhelm, right? And he was just adamant that his word was his favorite phrase was Germany just wants its place in the sun. But that was all down the whole
Which just
population.
happens to be dominating the entire world.
Yeah, but they wanted to be equals with Britain, and
right. World
and-
War I was, there was that. They were also tied up in a bunch of treaties that kind of,
yeah, and the German population, World War I, they were also gung ho about war, and so was the British citizenry, you know, because they all thought it was going to be done by Christmas.
right. Well, the British had been fighting wars of expansion for
Yeah.
a few hundred years then.
Yeah, but
mean,
my
it-
point is nations don't engage in all-out war unless these days, unless the citizenry are gung ho about it. You know, they're willing to send their sons to die, and now daughters as well.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of war theory that you can't win a war unless you have the support of, I'm trying to, Napoleon's quote was like, you know, skirmishes are won on
Right.
tactics, you know, battles are won on strategy and wars are won on logistics. Or
Yeah.
sorry, no, it's a different quote, like morale of the populace is worth
Well,
yeah.
more
That,
Yeah.
that's a good
guns in
question.
the field.
That's a very good question, because it seems to me that the spread of freedom in the 20th century was due more to the power of the example of freedom than it was to the example of our power. We need guns in diplomacy, but I don't think that ideas, good or bad, cannot be defeated with guns.
No.
It just doesn't work. We will fertilize the hatred of militant jihadis every time we kill a loved one or a neighbor of any kind.
Right.
Whether we mean it or not, it's an attack on their religion, among other things. But I guess what I'm saying is that whether, even if you defeat a people or a nation with guns and collateral damage and whatever, you still have to persuade them that being free and being at liberty is a good aspiration to have. Maybe we haven't realized it in all cases, but that's still, it's an aspiration. It doesn't exist yet. You know, we're moving towards it, or we try to.
And often the population has been waiting for that, but they've just been afraid to do it because the leader won't allow it. So it's really interesting. I remember this economist had this theory of preference falsification, where he was talking about in Soviet Russia, most of the population disapproved of the government, but they couldn't say it in public, because they would be punished for it. But a lot of times the general population is waiting for a better government, but they're just unable to do it because the leaders prevent it from happening.
Well, I mean, this is much. I'm not sure this is exactly about war, but this gets into others. I mean, Wilson, and since we're talking about the League of Nations and following World War I, Wilson had this idea, President Woodrow Wilson, about spreading democracy around the world, and that it would just kind of take hold, and that's still kind of been a part of U.S. thought. I mean, going all the way up to George W. Bush and Cheney and the neocons was that idea. Was that they talked openly about that? Actually, we're going to defeat Iraq and we'll set up a democracy, and then that'll cause a domino effect. I mean, Tony Blair was saying stuff like that too. And if anything, since the U.S. invaded Iraq, we've seen, the Middle East countries probably go backwards in terms of democracy. We've seen kind of a retreat of democracy around the world.
So it didn't work. Yeah.
And the thing is, the Middle Eastern specialists in the State Departments will all say, no, that will not work. And of course, the neocons just believed in the myths that they created and said, no, we will spread freedom all over, and with totally no attempt to understand the cultures that they're dealing with. And
you can't spread freedom by force.
No,
you can only spread it by persuasion.
No.
That's my point.
They'll have to want it, and they'll have to know how to, because, democracy is not a simple thing.
But
I think by now the West should understand that you can't just go in and hold elections and then there you'll have democracy. The democracy works there are certain underlying conditions that should prevail in the mental habits of people and cultures for democracy to work. Otherwise, you'll just have, I've seen it firsthand in the country where I grew up, you'll just have the trappings of democracy, but it's still the same old pre-democratic, maybe even feudal social structure that's operating. And so, but anyway, we're straying away from the topic. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, this is straying away.
No, I think those are interesting considerations, though.
Maybe some other day. Yeah.
Because we actually, at least for the podcast, I think we should end soon. we can actually, if you guys want, talk a little bit afterwards. But for the podcast, I think maybe we can move on to the last question
Mhm.
because it's almost 9. So actually, I want to have a discussion soon with you guys about morality in general. But so this will be an introduction to that discussion, maybe
Sure.
a couple of weeks from now or something. But it's basically something that like in the chat that we have, that Matthew has, the question that Matthew has been raising. But this is a question that philosophers have been raising this question for a couple of thousand years, which is what determines morality in the first place. So when we talk about the morality of war, like, how is it possible? Is it even possible for us to answer these questions? Like, how can we answer if something is moral or not? Is it, can we actually provide objective answers to these questions, or are we just drawing from this some sort of relative moral code? Are there real answers for these questions, or is it just, it really depends on the point of view?
There is like a real fundamental morality that is basically intrinsic with both fulfilling the human species and sustaining it in a sustaining it for the long term.
Right.
And I think there is really a very concrete, definable morality that makes those things possible. And I don't think it's anything. And I don't think it's even things that can be copied from examples in nature. I think it can be compiled by research and study and observation. But I think defining that morality is part of our responsibility as a species, is figuring out what that really needs to be. But I think it's a specific thing.
Yeah, I would say that usually these two topics are closely connected, like morality and war. And we may argue that most of war are caused because of, people say that this is moral and other people say, no, this is immoral. And essentially like most of the wars are happening because of people argue what is objective morality and what we should do and what we shouldn't do, how we should treat each other. And so the idea is that if you want to say that this is moral, this is what we must do, some other people may say, no, it's like it's just your subjective opinion, and you may say, no, this is like everybody should accept certain terms and we should follow certain rules. And then again, there's a conflict, and we basically create a war because we want to say that these rules which we decide are the best for human species, or some people may say, no, why we should only limit ourselves with our species? Let's talk about like life itself, or reasonable life, or rational life. So like when you draw the boundaries, when you say that this is only one thing which matters, you essentially create some kind of an opposition. And this opposition leads always to some conflicts, and essentially we have wars. And I also want to add something about like the previous topic about atomic weapons. So I think that weapons itself is more responsible for war than leaders and populations. So as soon as we create certain weapons, there's no, like in this novel by Chekhov, so if there's a gun on the wall, at the end it's going to fight. So if we create a weapon, we certainly will find a way how to try it and how to apply it, and independently on how many lives it may cost or how many troubles it will cost. and we are very good at creating like new weapons.
Are you saying, Vladimir, that any weapon that gets invented will eventually be used?
Yeah, obviously.
Oh,
Like
that doesn't sound good for us then, because there
well, it
are
doesn't sound
I think
good,
he
but
has a point though.
There-
I bet
yeah.
when they decided to use the atomic weapon, it was partially to test it. You know?
Yeah, I know, but there are thousands of nuclear
Right, yeah, we
warheads
haven't
under the
used
ground
hydrogen
right
bombs.
now. So I don't, if you do believe that eventually, within finite time, any weapon that gets invented is going to be used, then we need to.
well, I
do
don't believe in
something.
finite time. I think like time is infinite. And
I know,
essentially,
but within during the existence of human civilization, for example, then we really need to work a little bit harder on de-escalating and
yeah, we may reduce
denuclearization. Yeah.
reduce these weapons. And now, since we already know how it works, so we already
Right.
tested atomic weapon. Doesn't
Yeah.
mean that we need to test it. Like we need to try to use this weapon in order to destroy humanity. But essentially, like as soon as we have certain weapon, certainly it looks as if we are going to try it.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll create some simulations. You know,
Well, on the other hand,
computers will fight like calculating what's going to happen if there's a war, and probably there will be some video games or virtual realities where we put the entire.
If you include testing as using, then yeah, maybe. But I thought use as in actual use. Yeah, but anyway.
Right. I think getting back to this question about morals and war is that one of the interesting reading my history is that most conquerors believe they're moral. Most conquerors believe that what they're doing is because of morality.
Mm-hmm.
One of the best examples is Yingzi, who became the Shi Huangdi, who is the first emperor of China. He was a very controversial figure in Chinese history. And he, by all historical accounts, was incredibly bloody and cruel.
Right.
He deliberately killed children of his enemies, even children of his allies, just to make sure they stayed in line.
Right.
But he's still a revered figure. And generally, the idea is that by uniting China, which had been several, squabbling states that had been fighting wars with each other for hundreds of years, essentially brought in peace and an era of prosperity and basically made it possible to have a united China and unify the culture, unify the writing and things like that. And it's the same if you look at like the Romans would say they're very moral. There's Roman morality, and that going out and defeating the Gauls and the Germans and the Celts and all these other tribes, they're building civilization, defeating, it was right to completely plow Carthage into the ground.
No, the Romans were not any more warlike than everyone else around the Mediterranean at that time. They were just more successful.
Right, but they justified their conquest. They said the Roman role was.
But you don't go and do something and believe. Yeah, that's just human nature. So everyone who waged war believed that they were in the side of morality.
But how can we tell if someone's right or wrong? Like how can the Germans, for example, believe that it was okay to kill inferior races, whereas most of the Allies didn't? How obviously nowadays, the Nazis lost, so the winners write the history books, and they also write morality, the dominant morality to a certain extent. So in the debate of public opinion, for the most part, the idea that killing inferior races is wrong, and dominating inferior races is wrong, and our ideas are right. But I mean, how do we know that?
So that's a good idea.
There's a test for that, right?
So that's a good idea
been
and a
talked
bad
about.
idea. Neither one can be defeated with guns.
That's the categorical imperative, or the golden rules. Basically, put yourself in the other person's place. Would you feel the same way if that was done to you? And so we already have ways of judging that, whether one person's belief in one moral precept is something that can translate universally. And in that case, Hitler thought it was moral to to eradicate Jewish people, and then just say, well, would you feel that way if it was you who was being eradicated? And
Well,
yeah, I think that's not as hard.
as I understand, Hitler believed that the German people were superior to all other people on earth.
Right.
And
Right.
that's a bad idea.
No, yeah, because it doesn't hold for, you wouldn't feel that way if you were on the other end of the stick,
That's correct.
right?
We don't treat animals that well. Like, yeah, I guess Hitler's whole idea is we don't have to feel that way because we're I think the Jews, he didn't even really consider them as normal human beings. So if you don't really-
It wasn't just the Jews. He particularly disliked
Right.
the Jews, but
He
I think
hated
it was more.
gypsies, right?
But-
It was more a feature of there being lots of them, but it was certainly not exclusive to the Jews.
Yeah, but let's not think that this is just unique to Hitler. This
No, it wasn't.
mode of
It's
thinking,
not.
yeah.
I was
Yeah.
using it as a matter of an example, right? Because
Sure.
in that case, you have two very clear different mentalities,
Right.
and different moralities. And my question is, yeah, how do we know? And you're saying it's the golden rule, okay?
Yeah, it's
Uh,
as simple as that. I think that's
but
Right,
how do we know the golden rule is right?
we don't really, but it seems to work the best, right? It seems to be the one that minimizes
See if you can persuade me that it's not.
Well, I just don't know if it's not something made up by us, which
Yeah, but that's not persuasive.
well,
Well-
no, there is an argument that, and this starts with believe it or not, Adam Smith and Hume and even I keep forgetting, there's a Chinese philosopher who also said that basically it stems from when Adam Smith wrote about it, he used the term sympathy, but now we think of it as empathy, that morality, ethical thinking starts really from empathy. If you see something bad happening to another person, it makes you, it makes you feel bad that it's happening to him, because you think of, well, there, but for the sake of God, go I. And he says that's the basis of moral thinking.
Right. The basis of karma is almost golden rule, is essentially
Right.
if you do bad unto others, bad will happen to you, basically, if you do something.
Yeah, but it's really a sentiment. It's not even an intellectual thing. It's just basically how we're wired for society to function, and for the species to propagate. We needed to have that. Otherwise, we wouldn't care if our family members died.
Right, but if we come back to the question of power, and going against the golden rule is, yeah, power essentially goes against, if one group can successfully conquer another group and take their resources, well, yeah, therefore, yeah, so what about those other guys? I mean, if we think about, how Europeans conquered the Native Americans, or Europeans conquered the Aborigines in Australia, I mean, you could say, well, yeah, maybe we should feel bad for these natives, but
If I can,
they didn't, and they didn't really pay a price for it.
if I can just add along those lines, Michael brought up earlier that if the emperor is successful, then it was justified or something. That I think that was Confucius, and at the time that he said that, he could be imprisoned for objecting to the point of view of the monarch. But
Right.
at the same time, I'm thinking, let's see, you were saying just a minute ago, Sashir, about the, oh gosh, I forgot.
About the
what
use
you-
of power. I mean, how does,
Yeah,
if you argue the golden rule is, or karma is something that, in Buddhist belief, Hindu beliefs, the karma is a rule of the universe. That said, there's been a history of Buddhist conquerors, and who certainly,
Yeah.
I mean, Ashoka, the first Buddhist emperor who spread Buddhism,
Yeah.
surely had no problem conquering,
No.
conquering a bunch of other people.
No. Yeah.
okay, I'm sorry, I forgot what I was gonna say. Took too long to get to it.
But this comes down to the question, I think Tasha was talking about whether this higher morality how it relates to war is, unfortunately, in human history, war has been successful in the exercise of power. And again, I'd say look at how Europeans conquered the Americas and Australia
And
Well,
Africa. for
and a
that.
lot of other places. Yeah. And did they really pay a price for their conquest of?
And you reminded me of
Not really, yeah.
what I was going to say. I was trying to add to what you were saying. I guess if somebody or a nation state is powerful, I suspect all of us stop short of saying or claiming that might makes right. I don't believe that, and I don't think anybody here does. But if we're truly dedicated to moral action, then at some point we can be hopeful that right can make might.
Mhm.
And so kind of flipping that around.
Right.
And it goes back to the point I was trying to make that even bad ideas can't really be defeated with guns. We need guns, because we may have a justifiable use for them. But ultimately, no matter what happens, you still have to persuade other people that what you want to do is good if you're being moral.
Right.
If you just want their resources, then that's not moral, I don't think. Not today.
Well, you not only have to persuade people who are your adversaries, you also have to listen to what they're trying to persuade you on, and like, for example, the rest of the world tends to think of Africa as this place of endless conflict, of endless, assassinations and war and famine and things like that. And famines right now are known to be politically instigated rather than true crop failures. But you can't just stop there and not go back to the history that part of the reason Africa is the way it is because the borders were drawn precisely to encourage conflict between the different tribal groups, or whatever you call it, language groups, and so really, if we want a moral, truly moral way of life to go on, it's both sides. Everyone has to look at everyone's grievances, because some of them truly are valid and some of them are, you cannot move forward without finding a solution for those things. Like, for example, the fact that most countries in Africa were designed to have two competing ethno-linguistic groups within the same borders. That's just a recipe for eternal, endless conflict. And yeah, just 2 cents.
Well, now that we have a little bit more understanding about science and biology and how our brain works, even though there's a lot of stuff we don't know,
Right.
it does seem that we inherited a lot of mechanisms from our ancestors, furry ancestors, and we can see our cousins, the chimpanzees, they have the same tendencies that we have.
Yeah.
We are wired in a certain way that war is very natural for us. That's sort of like how we operate. That's how, if you look at chimpanzees, they act in a very similar way,
Sure.
and they're the closest thing we have from us. So I think I'm thinking maybe part of our morality, what we try to determine is moral or not moral, is perhaps an attempt to sort of cope with those shortcomings that we inherited genetically, because if not, we're always going to be killing each other, because that's what comes natural to us, but we don't want that. And I
Right.
think morals, well, I think we kind of create them, to be honest, and we create them as a mechanism to protect ourselves from what is really our nature, which is not what we consider moral. It's really more a violent nature, and that's really what we are. And I think
Well, I don't,
rationality tries to protect us from ourselves.
I understand what you're saying, but I personally stop short of saying that human beings are inherently violent. And the reason that I say that or think that is because everyone that I know, most of the people I have met have never killed another person.
Right.
So to say that human beings are inherently violent is, to me, focuses on the bad things of the past, and of which there were, but I still think that the best way for us to make progress towards a non-violent community, global community, is to try to get along.
Yeah.
And a war ends because somebody wins. In the struggle of ideas, somebody wins when you win over.
Mhm.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Well, humans, I think, are mixed. If you look at our primates, I mean, relatives, I mean, there's chimps, which are warlike society. There's bonobos, which negotiate through sex. There's gorillas, which are cooperative society. And I think humans kind of fall in between those. We're not
Well,
really.
No,
I do think we make progress
Yeah.
because at
No.
one point in time,
right.
the only way we perpetuated the species
Yeah.
was rape.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness we don't do that anymore.
Right.
Well, we could.
Well,
Yeah,
we
there's
recognize
a
that as
danger of
wrong.
over.
Well, the
Yeah,
rape, sorry.
there's a danger of overextending this metaphor of, well, not even a metaphor. It is a biological fact that we have our primate cousins. Yeah, but there is one big difference that we do have an intellect. We do have a fairly developed prefrontal cortex that is able to look into maybe our deep built-in desires, and as David said, that's why none of us I think have ever tried to kill another person, in this conversation, and most people we know have not. And so we should see hope in the fact that we do have an intellectual side that is able to reason and able to suppress our baser instincts and
Well, I
Violence comes out of just a lack of safety.
yeah.
I think it's really all it is. It's what important, the things that are important to me. How do I protect them?
Right.
What do I have at my disposal to protect them? If I don't have anything that I confidently can protect what's important to me with,
Right.
then it's violence. I think it's
Right.
just,
You push a person, any
Right.
person, far enough, and cognition requires a lot of effort.
I don't know. I think violence might be more ingrained in that. We just have other ways of expressing it. I think through things like sports and stuff, I think are essentially violence.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I don't think you were here with us this year when we were talking about the sports. I don't think you were. I think were you? I think
I was here for one. I thought maybe
Yeah.
not.
no. There was one that we just talked about sports.
Right.
And I think that sports, specifically some sports like team sports, they're really a representation of war in our minds, and that's really how they came about. So I agree that this is what I'm saying. Like, we figure out ways to express our violence in non-violent ways, but it's certainly still there
Right,
Well,
but like even
because
with
we're
sport,
wired that way.
you could be violent, you could be aggressive because you have something to protect. It's just a protection mechanism. I don't want to lose my pride, my earnings, my popularity, my, it's a protection. It's just a protection thing. So
It's-
if you have security in things where you don't have to protect it, where you know that it is sound, or at the very least that you can be successful without a number of things, and that comes from like some certain religions, then you have the capacity to not be violent.
Yes.
So my view is, I think most human beings are like that. I think there are a few that have a tendency to aggression, even if they have everything they need.
Oh, yeah.
I think a good government,
We call them sociopaths.
Yeah.
I think there's far more than a few.
Yeah, it's more like a mental disorder where they
Yeah.
don't know that they have everything they need, or
Right.
so
But
yeah,
anyway, go ahead, Michael.
but a lot of leaders are like sociopaths, they say. A lot of times that the kind of traits that make someone rise to the top are
Right.
sociopathic
Yeah.
traits. So
Mhm.
so I think most human beings, unless they're really threatened or their security is at risk, they won't become violent. There are there are a few, I think, that may. And I think what you want is you want a government with a lot of checks and balances, so as to minimize that risk. And I think that the big issue is when you have governments that don't have a sufficient number of checks, then you can get one of those people rising to the top. And I think that's the source of a lot of our problems.
I gotta go. I gotta take care of kids. So
Yep.
good to
Okay.
see you guys
Good
again.
to see you, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha. Yeah, I think this is a good time to end it. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and subscribe to the channel if you can, and we'll be back next Friday.